The ABCs of Black History by Rio Cortez, illustrated by Lauren Semmer. A is for anthem, a banner of song that wraps us in hope, lets us know we belong. We lift up our voices, lift them and sing. From stages and street corners, let freedom ring. Let us march on till victory is won. B is for beautiful, I'm talking to you. Your voice, your height, your hair, your hue. B is for brave, for bright, and for bold. For those who stood up even when they were told to step back, stand down, remember their place. B is for brotherhood, for believing in grace. C is for community, where we live, laugh, and eat. And for church, where we worship, mourn, sing, and meet. Did you hear Reverend King preach on his dream of civil rights, human rights? A powerful theme. D is for dysphoria, pulled from our homes. We were carried away in ships on the foam. To Haiti, Cuba, America, Brazil, our names are different, new, but still, we are connected, then, now, forevermore, to that long ago, far away African shore. E is for explore, to study a place, like Matthew Henson, the Arctic, Mae Jemison, space. E is for education, for expanding the mind, like Ruby Bridges, Linda Brown, the Little Rock Nine. The first black children in all white schools, they opened the doors and challenged the rules. F is for food, grown and farmed with our hands, worked and tilled and pulled from the land. For fried fish, ham hocks, warm buttermilk bread, or maybe the sharp taste of mustards instead. F is for folklore by the light of the moon, for family, for freedom, for jumping the broom. G is for go, toward cities we were bound, for the great migration from country to town. From farming the land to the factory floor, we carried the blues on our backs, not much more. H is for Harlem, those big city streets. We walked and we danced to our own jazzy beat. When Louie and Bessie and Duke owned the stage, and Langston and Zora Neale Hurston the page. I is for imagine, invent, innovative, for all of the ways we are so creative. J is for Juneteenth. We were finally free, or so we hoped in this moment of glee. J is for Juve, when the drummers drum. From Trinidad, Grenada, and Haiti they come. K is for kin, our fathers and mothers, our ancestors, elders, our sisters and brothers. K is for Kwanzaa, which honors that bond. Ask Habari Gani, and we might respond. Umoja, unity. Kuji Chagulia, or self-determination or believing in your own strength. Ojima, collective work and responsibility or taking care of our kin. Ojima'a, cooperative economics or working hard to create new businesses and support other businesses in the community. Nia, purpose. Kuumba, creativity. Imani, faith. L is for love. L is for love. L is always for love. M is for march, for lifting our feet, taking the movement, the cause to the street. Black lives matter, every breath, every dream, every thought, each idea, each impossible scheme. The might of our message is easy to hear. The drumbeat of hope is louder than fear. N is for newspapers. We started our own, to tell our stories and let it be known. We deserve the front page. We deserve to be seen and to also be featured in slick magazines. O is for organize, for getting together, to sit in and boycott to make our lives better. Thank you, Fred Hampton. Thank you, Diane Nash, for not being afraid of the possible clash with police and people who shouted and teased. Because of you, we can go where we please. P is for power. It's part of our core. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it must roar. Like a panther, isn't that right, Huey P? Power for people like you and like me. And who do you think has more power than most? The president. Obama was first to that post. But Shirley Chisholm, unbossed and unbought, came so much closer than most people thought. A black woman could, which just goes to show, P is for possible, so glow on, child, glow. Q is for queens, behold them bow down. Shield your eyes from the shine of their crowns. R is for rise, to reach for the top, relentlessly striving, refusing to stop. Like ball players, boxers, and gymnasts who fly, sprinters and skaters who zoomed right on by. Old records, old thinking, a sight to behold. They went on for the win and grabbed for the gold. S is for scientists who charted the stars, studied the bees, took care of our hearts. For Benjamin Banneker, Patricia Bath, for Katherine Johnson's beautiful math. S is for soul, how sweet the sound, from the croon of Sam Cooke to the wail of James Brown. Brother Ray at the keys, Sister Tharp dressed in mink, and Queen Aretha sang, "You Betta Think." T is for Tuskegee, an all-black school, where students learned trades and toiled with tools. That's how we will rise, said Boss Booker T, but another smart man just didn't agree. W.E.B. Du Bois said industry's fine, but I think it's better to work on your mind. They had different ideas, but here's what's true. In their own ways, they were thinking of you. U is for United States. This story is tough. The birth of a nation was deadly for us. We the people in the land of the free? No one who was enslaved would agree. U is for unbroken, unshaken, unbound, like Harriet Tubman who went underground, took back her freedom and freed hundreds more, some as a spy in the Great Civil War. But when the states were united again, the fight for our freedom and lives didn't end. So U is for unfinished, this American tale. With courage and strength, we will prevail. V is for vote. Do you know what that means? The freedom to pick and choose as you please. The freedom to choose who makes the rules, who has the power, who gets the tools. To make their lives better, that's why we fight. The freedom to vote is a true civil right. W is for writers, whose wisdom and words bring to life worlds where our voices are heard. Rappers and poets and songwriters too, all of those who spin from our point of view. X is for Malcolm Malik El-Shabazz, known also as Red Malcolm Little El-Hajj. By any means necessary, he insisted on change. Starting with X, he reclaimed his name. Y is for young, gifted, and black, like Lady Lorraine, who never looked back. She wrote of big dreams in rooms so small, it's hard to believe they were dreamed in at all. Lorraine and her work moved Nina Simone, so much that Nina made work of her own. Young, gifted, and black, a banner of song that wraps us in hope, lets us know we belong. Z is for zenith, the highest, the peak, the top of that mountain King said we would reach. He won't get there with us, but still we march on, rising, rising, like the sun with the dawn. The ABCs of Black history, terms and figures. Black history is a story of heartbreak and triumph, of incredible creativity, joy, and light, sometimes in the face of terrible pain. It is the story of always moving forward, of hope that each day will be better than the one before. Such a story, that spans continents and centuries, is too big to capture here. But we offered a glimpse. As you read, what connections can you make? James Baldwin, 1924 to 1987. James Baldwin was brilliant. He was a child preacher, a novelist, poet, philosopher, and a son of Harlem who thought black people should be included in America's promise of liberty and justice for all. And he was a gay man who believed that when it comes to love, you should go the way your blood beats. A is for anthem. An anthem is a song that brings people together and gives them a sense of pride. Lift Every Voice and Sing was written at a time when black people were no longer enslaved, but still were not free. Their rights were severely limited, and their lives were threatened every day, especially in the South. They needed something to make them feel strong and to give them hope. Lift Every Voice and Sing is a poem written in the late 1890s by activist and scholar James Weldon Johnson, and set to music by his brother, John Rosamond Johnson. In 1919, Lift Every Voice and Sing became the official song of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, an organization that strives to make life better for Black people, and is unofficially known as the Black National Anthem. B is for beautiful. We're not the first to say Black is beautiful. Back in the 1960s and 70s, Black people were loud and proud about their look, sound, and style. Photographers Gordon Parks and Kwame Brathwaite captured that look on film, and Soul Train, a music and dance show created by Don Cornelius, celebrated Black style on television. C is for community. A community is any group of people that makes you feel welcome. It might be a neighborhood, a school, a mosque, a synagogue, or a church. The church has a special place in Black history. It was a place where African Americans felt safe and comfortable. In the 1950s, as Black people continued to fight to be fully recognized as human beings, church leaders came together to do their part. They chose Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., a young minister at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, as their spokesperson. Reverend King went on to become a powerful voice in the fight for civil rights. D is for dysphoria. African dysphoria refers to the spread of people from the continent of Africa to other parts of the world. From the 1500s to the 1800s, this spread happened because of the transatlantic, across the Atlantic, slave trade. During that time, traders from Western Europe arrived in what is now Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Angola, Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Gabon, Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Sudan, and the Cameroon. They traded their goods for human beings who were sold into slavery in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the United States. At least 12 million Africans were kidnapped and sold. The African dysphoria also refers to people from African countries who settle in different parts of the world today. E is for explore education. Education has always been an important part of our story. Most enslaved people were not allowed to read or write. By making literacy illegal, their enslavers controlled the information they had access to and prevented them from sending messages to one another, or so the enslavers thought. Many enslaved people found a way, often at great risk. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved people saw education as a path to true freedom and equality. They went to Black-only schools, and in 1896, the Supreme Court made separate schools for the Black children and white children the law. 55 years later, in 1951, the parents of Linda Brown wanted her to attend her neighborhood public school, which was only 7 blocks away. But the school was for white children only, and Linda was Black. The nearest school for Black children was 21 blocks away. Encouraged by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Linda's parents sued the Topeka Board of Education. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court and was argued by Thurgood Marshall, who would become the first Black justice on the Supreme Court. In 1954, the court decided that there should not be separate public schools for Black children and white children anywhere in the United States. This was a good thing, but it also meant that many all-Black schools closed and thousands of talented Black teachers were suddenly out of work. In 1957, 9 students, Minnie Jean Brown, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Thelma Mothershed, Melba Patillo, Gloria Ray, Terrence Roberts, Jefferson Thomas, and Carlotta Walls tried to go to all-white Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. But the governor and angry mobs blocked them for months. In 1960, when 6-year-old Ruby Bridges tried to go to an all-white school in New Orleans, The National Guard had to protect her from the angry crowd. Eventually, Ruby Bridges and the Little Rock Nine were allowed to go to school. Along with Linda Brown, they were among the first black students to integrate all-white schools. And who are Matthew Henson and Mae Jemison? Matthew Henson is the first black person to reach the North Pole as part of an expedition led by Robert Peary in 1909. Depending on your perspective, the North Pole is the top of the world, but Mae Jemison went even further than that. On September 12, 1992, she became the first black woman in space as an astronaut aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour. F is for food, farm, fried fish, folklore. Black people have been farming in the United States for 4 centuries, beginning with the forced labor of the enslaved. After the Emancipation Proclamation declared slavery illegal in the South in 1863, many African Americans stayed on their enslavers' plantation and worked as sharecroppers. They rented the land they lived on, and they paid their rent with a portion of their crops. By 1920, there were nearly 1 million African American farmers in the United States. Soul food described a style of African American cooking that has its roots in the early farming and food preparation methods of the enslaved. Enslaved Africans were given small amounts of food weekly, often cornmeal, flour, lard, molasses, and leftover scraps of meat, including pig intestines, feet and tails, oxtails, and chicken necks, that they cooked and flavored as best they could. For fresh food, enslaved people hunted, fished, gathered nuts and berries, and grew vegetables for themselves. Some common soul food dishes include fried fish, ham hocks, pig knuckles, buttermilk cornbread, and mustard greens. Enslaved people were not allowed to legally marry. Instead, at the end of a wedding ceremony, a couple would jump over a broomstick. This ceremonial practice of jumping the broom became the way that enslaved people could publicly commit to one another. Some African Americans continue the practice today to honor their ancestors. G is for Great Migration. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery legally, African Americans were not free in the South. Southern states created laws called Black Codes that restricted the movement and opportunities of the formerly enslaved. Black people were also terrorized and killed just for being black, especially if they dared to fight back against the restrictive laws. And so, between 1915 and 1970, roughly 6 million black people fled the South for better lives in the North, Midwest, and West. This was known as the Great Migration. To migrate means to move from one place to another. They traveled mostly by train to cities like Chicago, which became a home of blues music, New York, which became a home to the Harlem Renaissance, and Detroit and Philadelphia, which also became centers of black music and culture. H is for Harlem, Hart, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston. Harlem, New York has long been a center of black creativity. In the 1920s, W.E.B. Du Bois and intellectual powerhouse Alain Locke believed it was time for a new Negro who excelled in literature and the arts. This was the beginning of an incredible period of black excellence known as the Harlem Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, James Weldon Johnson, Jean Toomer, Arna Bontemps, Conte Cullen, and Claude McKay created poetry and prose. Performers like Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, Louis Armstrong, Ethel Waters, Bill Bojangles Robinson, Ma Rainey, and Ubi Blake lit up Harlem stages like the Apollo Theater. Thinkers like Paul Robeson, Marcus Garvey, and Arthur Schomburg talked about freedom. Artists like Henry O. Tanner, James Vanderzee, Aaron Douglas, and Augusta Savage captured black life on film, in paint, and in clay. There were opportunities for entrepreneurs, too, like Lillian Harris Dean, better known as Pigfoot Mary, who sold steamed pig's feet from a baby carriage to to hungry customers streaming out of late-night clubs. Even though the Renaissance faded in the 1930s, Harlem remains an important center of African American culture to this day. I is for imagine, invent, innovate. African Americans have invented and elevated so many things. These are just a few. George Washington Carver was a scientist. He was in charge of the farming program at Tuskegee Institute, an all-black college led by Booker T. Washington. Carver invented more than 300 peanut products, but not peanut butter. Madam C.J. Walker, real name Sarah Breedlove, cared for our hair. Her hair products and New York salon made her the first self-made woman millionaire in the United States. Gwendolyn Brooks was a poet. She often wrote about Bronzeville, her Chicago neighborhood, and became the first black poet laureate of the United States. Alan Ailey danced. He founded a modern dance troupe that performed dances celebrating black culture. The Alan Ailey American Dance Theater is still around today. DJ Kool Herc helped invent hip-hop. He extended the drum break of every song so people could find their groove. If you ever hear anyone say, "Those are the breaks," or "break it down," thank DJ Kool Herc. Jean-Michel Basquiat made art. He made art all over New York City that was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Jean-Michel Basquiat had a voice. J is for Juneteenth, Juve morning. On June 19, 1865, Union troops marched into Texas, the last state where people were still enslaved, and announced that the Civil War was over and all enslaved people were free. The date, June 19th, became known as Juneteenth. Juve means morning or break of day in French. Today, in Caribbean countries like Trinidad, Tobago, Grenada, and anywhere there is a large Caribbean population, Juve is part of Carnival, a joyful celebration before the quieter period of prayer and fasting known as Lent. Juve started in Trinidad. In the early 1800s, the British brought 700 enslaved people from America to settle in Trinidad. There were also French landowners living in the area, and to mark the harvest, they held celebrations called Caniboulet. In 1838, when slavery in Trinidad was abolished, the newly freed people took over the Caniboulet traditions and made them their own, adding dance and music traditions that had been forbidden while they were enslaved. Over time, these celebrations became what we know now as Juve. K is for Kin Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa is a 7-day celebration that was created in 1966 by Dr. Muana Kuringa to celebrate family and community. Kwanzaa is celebrated from December 26th to January 1st every year, and each day has a meaning. Day 1, Umoja, unity. Day 2, Kujichagulia, or self-determination or believing in your own strength. Day 3, Ojima, collective work and responsibility or taking care of our kin. Day 4, Ojima'a, cooperative economics or working hard to create new businesses and support other businesses in the community. Day 5, Nia, purpose. Day 6, Kuumba, creativity. Day 7, Imani, faith. The 7 principles are represented each day by lighting a candle in a kinara. The language of Kwanzaa is Kiswahili, which is spoken in many African countries and is the official language of Tanzania and Kenya. L is for love. Rose and Ashley, mid-1800s, were mother and daughter. Both were enslaved. When Ashley was sold at the age of 9, Rose hardly had time to say goodbye. She gave Ashley a sack that held the scraps of a dress, handfuls of pecans, and a braid of Rose's hair. They never saw each other again, but the sack has survived generations. Nat Love was a cowboy. He herded cattle in Texas and Arizona before giving up that life to work on the railroad. Ruby Dee and Ozzie Davis were love. This pioneering power couple acted in plays, in the original production of A Raisin in the Sun, for example, and movies, and they fought for humanity and freedom everywhere. Mildred Loving loved. She married a white man even though it was illegal for black and white people to be married in her home state of Virginia. Her case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which decided that her marriage was legal and true. Marsha Pay No Mind Johnson was a transgender activist. She demanded to be recognized as her full self and fought for gay, lesbian, transgender, and bisexual people to be fully recognized too. M is for March Matter. Marches, taking to the street in large peaceful protests, send a powerful message. One of the best known marches is the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. to hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. deliver his I Have a Dream speech. In it, he outlined his vision of a unified America. But the March on Washington wasn't the only march of the civil rights movement. There were smaller marches and boycotts in cities across the nation calling for better jobs, better housing, and better lives. On March 7, 1965, John Lewis, who believed in making good trouble and would later become a U.S. congressman, attempted to lead a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, the state capital. He and his followers wanted the government to lift the restrictions that prevented black people from voting. State troopers and local police brought the march to a violent end, and the event became known as Bloody Sunday. Finally, on March 21st, 3,200 people marched out of Selma. 5 days, 54 miles later, and 25,000 people strong, the marchers arrived in Montgomery. In 2012, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, who was black, was shot and killed. A year later, when the man who killed Trayvon was not found guilty of murder, Patrice Kahn-Coolers, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi started an organization called Black Lives Matter to protect and uplift black people. In 2020, after Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd were senselessly killed, Black Lives Matter was the rallying cry at protests around the world. N is for newspapers. The rich tradition of African American newspapers and periodicals began as a way to further the cause of the abolitionist movement. The North Star was an anti-slavery magazine founded by the abolitionist Frederick Douglass in 1847. African American newspapers are a source of information, political activism, and pride for the black community. Some of these major newspapers include the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, Richmond Planet, and Chicago Bee. Ida B. Wells was a newspaper journalist. Beginning in the 1890s, she shed light on the many violent deaths of African Americans at the hands of white people in the South. These murders are called lynchings. Wells researched her articles carefully and published them in newspapers she co-owned called the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, among others. Wells' writing was so widely read that she was sometimes known as the Princess of the Press. From newspapers to glossy magazines, Johnson's publishing company was founded by John H. Johnson in 1942 and was, at one time, the largest black-owned publishing company in the world. Johnson Publishing Company published the Negro Digest, Jet, and Ebony magazine, which is still in print today. O is for organize organizations. Protests, boycotts, and marches all need someone to pull them together. Here are some of the major African American organizations and organizers. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC was founded in 1960 to give a voice to young people and students in the civil rights movement. Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. CORE was founded in 1942 and worked with other civil rights groups to launch the Freedom Summer, voter registration project, the Freedom Riders, aimed at desegregating buses and bus terminals, and the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. Diane Nash is a civil rights leader who began as a student activist in SNCC. She participated in the Freedom Rides and helped to integrate lunch counters and bus terminals. She continues to fight for a fairer world. Fred Hampton was an activist and revolutionary. He was a leader in the Black Panther Party in Chicago and founded the Rainbow Coalition, a multicultural alliance that worked towards social change. Ella Baker was a leading activist and organizer in the civil rights movement. She worked with the NAACP and helped to found Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference and SNCC. Bayard Rustin helped Dr. King understand the power of breaking unjust laws and was a key organizer of the March on Washington. He was criticized for being gay, but remained true to who he was. P is for Power, Black Panthers, People, President. In many ways, the struggle of African Americans has always been about power. A fight against the powers that hold us back, and to fight for the power that comes with being truly free. In the 1960s and 70s, Black Power was a rallying cry. It was first used publicly by Stokely Carmichael, later named Kwame Ture, in 1966. Black Power was a call for African Americans to come together, rise up, and take back the rights and freedoms they had long been denied. There are many different kinds of power. Here are a few people and groups who wielded it in their own ways. The Black Panther Party was a political group formed by Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton in Oakland, California in 1966. The Black Panthers sought to protect African American neighborhoods from police brutality and to help feed African American children. In fact, the school breakfast and lunch programs that exist in some schools today were inspired by the work of the Black Panthers. Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman in Congress, where she proposed laws that gave more power to women and African Americans. In 1972, she became the first woman and the first African American to seek the nomination of a major party in the presidential election. And when she wrote the story of her life, she called it Unbought and Unbossed. Barack Obama was the 44th President of the United States and the first African American to serve in that office. In 2020, presidential candidate Joe Biden chose California Senator Kamala Harris as his vice president running mate. Harris's mother was born in India, her father was born in Jamaica, and when Biden and Harris won the 2020 presidential election, Harris became the first woman of color, the first Black person, and the first South Asian American to be elected Vice President of the United States. Q is for Queens. There are ancient queens, queens who were heroes in our history, and queens who live among us today. Their royalty comes from their accomplishments and power. Not all queens wear crowns. Queen Nefertiti was an ancient Egyptian queen renowned for her beauty. She ruled aside Pharaoh Akhenaten and was perhaps one of the most powerful women who has ever ruled. Queen Amina was queen of a medieval African kingdom called Zazu in present-day Nigeria. She was also a skilled warrior and a legend among the Hasu people. Queen Nandi Nasivi Kabihi of what is now South Africa was queen mother of the Zulus and the daughter of Bepi, a past chief of the Langi tribe. She was a mother who fought hard to protect herself and her children. Her son Shaka became a famous Zulu king. Queen Ya Asimitwa was an Ashanti queen from present-day Ghana who inspired her people to fight for independence against British rule. Ruby Hurley was known as the Queen of Civil Rights and was a leader in the civil rights movement and within the NAACP. Leontine Price was an American opera singer who is known around the world for her voice. She made her debut at the Metropolitan Opera on January 27, 1961. Toni Morrison was one of America's greatest authors. She was also a book editor, college professor, and mother. Angela Y. Davis is an activist, feminist, revolutionary, and scholar. Today, she focuses much of her power on changing the prison system. Michelle Obama is a lawyer, an author, and the former First Lady of the United States. She is married to America's 44th President, Barack Obama. She is the closest thing we have to American royalty. R is for rise, reach, relentless, refuse. Here are just a few African American athletes you should know. Go team! Jesse Owens was a runner. At the 1936 Olympics, held in Germany at the time when German leader Adolf Hitler had declared that white people were superior to everyone else, Owens won 4 gold medals for track and field events. Jackie Robinson rose out of the Negro Leagues to become the first African American baseball player to play in the majors. He faced a lot of discrimination along the way and was ultimately the first black player inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Althea Gibson was a champion. She was a tennis and golf superstar. Muhammad Ali was a championship boxer and political activist. He fought for civil rights and rose up against war. Arthur Ashe was an American tennis player who accomplished many firsts. He was the first, and remains the only, African American man to be ranked the #1 tennis player in the world. Florence Griffin Joyner had style. Also known as FloJo, she was the fastest woman in the world, and she had the most amazing long fingernails. Shawnee Davis is fast. He grew up on roller skates and became one of the fastest speed skaters in the world. Gabby Douglas is an American gymnast and the first African American to win the individual all-around event. S is for scientists, stars, study, soul, sweet, sound, sang. Benjamin Banneker was a free black man during the time of slavery and self-educated scientist, farmer, almanac writer, and mathematician. Dr. Daniel Hale Williams was a doctor and the first person to open a hospital with an integrated staff. He was one of the first doctors to perform open heart surgery. Charles Henry Turner was a zoologist who made many discoveries that have helped us learn more about the natural world. He was especially interested in the habits of honeybees. Vivian Thomas was an African American laboratory supervisor who, even without a medical degree, discovered a way to save babies with a dangerous heart condition. Katherine Johnson was an African American mathematician and author. She made important contributions to the U.S. space program and helped astronauts go to the moon. Dr. Patricia Bath was the first African American ophthalmologist and an inventor. She developed new ways to help people see more clearly and accomplished many firsts in her field. Kizzmekia Corbett is a scientist who studied the novel coronavirus that caused the 2020 pandemic. She led a team that was first in the world to test a possible vaccine. What is soul? There's no one answer to that question, except that it has its roots in the music and feeling of the African American church. Here are a few of the most soulful people we know. Sister Rosetta Tharpe grew up singing in church before she became the godmother of rock and roll. Ray Charles is known as the high priest and the genius of soul. James Brown is known as the godfather of soul. Aretha Franklin is known as the queen of soul, and Sam Cooke as the king. T is for Tuskegee Institute, trade, toil, tools, true. The Tuskegee Institute was founded in 1881 by Booker T. Washington and was one of the first of higher learnings for African Americans. Tuskegee Institute was also the training ground for the U.S. military's first all-black flying unit. They were known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Today, there are 101 historical black colleges and universities. Booker T. Washington was a thinker, educator, and author. At one time, he was the most famous African American in the country. He believed that farming and hard labor were the best ways for Black people to gain the respect of white society. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, wasn't as concerned about respect. He thought Black people should demand better, and that talented intellectuals should lead the fight. In 1909, he helped found the NAACP. U is for the United States. When the U.S. Constitution was first written in 1787, its opening line, "We the people," did not include African Americans. In fact, Black people were not fully counted as people at all. The white men who wrote the Constitution thought that the amount of money and recognition each state got from the federal government should be based on the number of people living in that state. Trouble was, more people lived in the northern states than in the South. But there were far more enslaved people in the South than in the North. To balance things out, the authors debated on humanity. They decided that each enslaved African should count as 3/5 of a person. According to the Federalist Paper number 54, which explains the author's thinking, enslaved people could not be considered fully human because they were not free. The 13th Amendment of the Constitution abolished slavery except as a punishment for a crime. The 14th Amendment granted the formerly enslaved American citizenship, and the 15th Amendment granted Black men, but not women, the right to vote. Although, as seen above, those rights were in question well into the 1960s. Harriet Tubman was an enslaved woman who liberated herself and freed at least 70 others. Tubman was also a conductor in the Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses where the enslaved hid as they escaped. When the states went to war over the issue of slavery, Harriet Tubman spied for the Union Northern Army. In 1863, she helped lead a secret mission on the Combahee River in South Carolina that freed more than 700 enslaved people. And that flag? It's inspired by the work of artist David Hammons, who in 1990 created a piece called African American Flag. The colors have been used to represent African American cultures since Marcus Garvey used them in the Black Liberation flag. Red stands for the bloodshed in the fight for freedom, black stands for Black people, and green stands for growth. V is for vote. A vote is one of the most powerful forces for change, and Black people have fought for that power for centuries. One of the earliest voices in this fight was Sojourner Truth. Born Isabella Bumfree, she also fought for women's rights and the end of slavery. One of the most visible fighters in later years was Fannie Lou Hamer. In 1964, she helped organize Freedom Summer, an effort to register Black voters in Mississippi. In 1965, after John Lewis marched from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. It was meant to protect Black voters, especially in the South, where they were often threatened or prevented from voting in other aggressive ways. In 2013, the Supreme Court removed some of these protections. In 2019, the House of Representatives, led by John Lewis, voted to put them back in. The issue has not been resolved, and the fight to vote freely continues. W is for Writers' Wisdom Words. There's a long tradition of African and African American storytelling from folktales to rap. Arthur Schomburg was a writer and collector of Black history. In 1911, in Harlem, he co-founded the Negro Society for Historical Research to celebrate work by Black authors. He collected books and manuscripts from all over the world, which eventually became part of the New York Public Library's collection. Today, the Schomburg Center for Research and Black Culture, part of the New York Public Library system, sits on Malcom X Boulevard in Harlem. X is for Malcom X. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, was a political leader, speaker, and father. He went to prison as a young man where he studied Islam and became a Muslim. He also changed his name from Malcolm Little to Malcom X, rejecting the last name he believed tied him to slavery. Enslaved people were given the last name of their enslavers to show ownership. When he was released from prison, X became a key player in the fight for civil rights. He believed in using any means necessary to advance the cause. However, after visiting the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, the holiest city in the Islamic faith, and seeing Muslims of all backgrounds come together, he embraced a more peaceful path. He also changed his name to El Hajj Malik El Sabaj. Y is for young, gifted, and black, you. Lorraine Hansberry was a playwright in Chicago. Her best-known work, A Raisin in the Sun, tells the story of a life in a kitchenette apartment on Chicago's South Side. Kitchenettes were tiny rooms that many black families were forced to crowd into because of unfair housing laws in the city. Hansberry borrowed the name of her play from a poem by Langston Hughes. After Hansberry's death, a friend shaped the writing she left behind into a play about her life called To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. Another good friend, Nina Simone, borrowed the title for a song. Nina Simone was a singer, songwriter, and activist. Her song, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, became an anthem of the civil rights movement in 1969. Z is for zenith. Zenith means peak, like the top of a mountain. It is also the time when something is at its most powerful. On April 3, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered what has become known as his mountaintop speech. In it, he said, "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The next day, Dr. King was killed. And when he fell, it was someone else's turn to push forward, just as Dr. King took his turn from those who came before. And so we'll march on till victory is won.